Tartaria. That subject that may be best encapsulated by the famous quote, "History is written by the victors." So, what is Tartaria? Well, supposedly, Tartaria was one of the largest and most powerful empires in all of history until roughly 1775, and one that you may not have even heard about, because as some believe, its history makes the official historical timeline of our world impossible. But what do we know? What we do know is that this vast and powerful empire is depicted on countless official maps and referenced in many texts from the past. So Tartaria did in fact exist. Now, whether it was merely a geographic description of an area of land, as some claim, or if it was actually an empire with its own flags, emperors, and outlying dominions, is a question up for debate. But certainly, the area did exist. Tartaria, originally pronounced Tartaria, is the name of the empire that originated in northern Asia before, as some suggest, expanded to the entire northern hemisphere. This would make Great Tartaria the largest empire during its time and would actually still be the largest empire today. It's put forth that the Tartarian Empire flourished due in part to the civilization being a leader in advanced technology, quite grand architecture, as you'll see, and perhaps even the free energy Nikola Tesla supposedly discovered. In recent years, interest in this alternative world history claim has arisen concerning this ancient kingdom that has either been ignored or purposely hidden. Its secrecy revolves around an alleged worldwide cataclysm believed by some to have taken place sometime in the early to mid 1800s. A disaster that wiped out this widespread advanced civilization and allowed the nations as we know them today to rise up. The event was a mud flood in which 10 to 40 feet of mud buried the ground levels of houses and buildings everywhere. It was a civilization reset, out with the old and in with the new, as they say, and that new civilization is claimed to be us. Now, we'll get back to this event later in the video, but let's first take a closer look of this map. What we'll see in looking at the map is you'll notice a area or boundary for this country that is in yellow. And here, if you can see, I'll try to get it just a little bit bigger. You can see Tartaria. Now, go back and you'll also see another area that's bounded with the same yellow border over here that may look familiar, and that is America. Now, something else that was very interesting was the border of this map, and I'll start here, this top corner, which is basically Europa or Europe. And as you'll see in the background, there's a kingdom, it looks like, in smoke and flames, possibly the destruction of the Roman Empire. And then we go to the first emperor of Rome, Julius Caesar. Next was Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula. Then Claudius, and finally Nero on the top frame. Then it goes over to Asia, where Tartaria was located. And down this side, you'll see Mexico, and you'll notice grand palaces here in Mexico. And just for reference, this map was dated to 1652. Then you'll have Americana, Havana. Again, you'll notice these grand structures. Americani, Pernambuco. I think that's actually in Brazil. But again, if you'll notice up on that hill, large kingdom, palaces, again, grand architecture. Magellan is depicted. And San Salvador, again, you'll see these grand structures. Then it goes to America, which is depicted as pretty much a wilderness. And I guess that may have been the first time they saw an armadillo. But then let's go over all the way to the other side. And you'll see the picture for Africa. And then we pick up again with the emperors. So next, after Nero, you had the 1 year period of 4 emperors of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian, who was formerly a general and led some of the attacks and conquering of Jerusalem, and Titus, his son, who would become emperor next, and then Domitian, his younger brother. But that is all of the, I'll zoom back out, that is all of the emperors. See the first up here and then the other ones here. Now, if this map was made in 1652, this would have been, centuries after the latest or final emperors of Rome. And so why would these be pictured? Just an interesting question. But the point of this map is to show that this large area here, again considered Tartaria, was a vast empire. A lot of the area of modern-day Russia, Mongolia, and what would be China now, India, Saudi Arabia, even the area of Palestine and Israel on into Asia Minor. And then, of course, it was spread all the way into the Americas and, as the yellow border indicates, even up into Canada. So that just gives you a good layout of geographically where Tartaria was said to exist. Now, again, to summarize, Tartaria was supposedly a world empire. Well, wait a minute, let's get this last map, because this one goes to 1754. And again, it's called Grand Tartaria. And again, it's in the area of Russia and where basically Asia is now. And this was as late as 1754. And even included as an overlay on the map is a definition from Encyclopedia Britannica dated 1771, where it says that Tartary was a vast country in the northern parts of Asia. And when you say country, that denotes borders and rulers or kings or elected officials, but some type of government administration there. And this can be documented as late as 1771. So again, to summarize, Tartaria was supposedly a world empire with technology in some cases greater than we have today that appears to have been a fairly wonderful place to live. Throughout the kingdom, which was truly intercontinental, magnificent structures were built. Many of the satellite kingdoms had very similar administration or government and education buildings grouped together for the local inhabitants. These buildings were veritable palaces by our standards today, and the architecture, as you see here, was simply magnificent. The residents were also just as lavish, and all the various locations under Tartarian rule seemed to be prosperous and peaceful. Now, as mentioned earlier, a cataclysmic event seems to have wiped out this civilization. However, many believe some of its buildings and structures remain today, some partially and some completely covered by mud and dirt. Now, how the people may have disappeared remains a mystery, but a theory gaining traction over the last few years is that these developed areas are what we inhabit today, and much of the history of the United States is actually built on the former Tartarian Empire cities. Now, but why this history may have been erased is a question for another time. Speculation there has led more rabbit holes than one could imagine. And you got some that say every 460 years, give or take, the filament that feeds the sun and all nearby stars reverses polarity. This reversal means the motor, so to speak, of the planets flips, causing chaos on the inhabited worlds, including tsunamis, earthquakes, and perhaps even mudfloods. Some even say our history is not nearly as long as we are taught, and that as much as 1,000 years has been added, making our current year around 1021 instead of 2021. Others, using this revised timeline, believe the end of Tartaria may have actually been the end of Christ's millennial or 1,000-year reign. If the 1,000 years or so of added time were true, the theory would roughly fit. Christ would have died about 1,000 years ago, returned in AD 70 to judge at the destruction of Jerusalem, and then began his millennial reign. As Revelation tells us, at the end of that time, Satan would be loosed again, but only for a short while. That would be from the time the Tartarian Empire ended a couple hundred years ago to our present time. Naturally, Satan would want that time of the 1,000-year reign hidden because it points to Christ and, of course, his own downfall. Others put forth the theory that the Tartarian Empire was simply overrun by evil people. The Tartarian people were eliminated, and now we are being controlled by those so-called parasites, and all our history has been changed and gravelled to cover it up. These parasites would know all about free energy, instead keep us slaves to their companies and their families who form the secret societies of the world. Now, I have no desire to prove any of that, as I don't think it would be possible even if some of the theories were true, which most I've heard so far I can't quite buy into. However, we do know Tartaria existed, and if the kingdom was truly spread out to many other countries, the evidence would be there, and that evidence is indeed intriguing. Now, this isn't going to be a grand expose on Tartaria, but rather a short introduction to the subject and key terms and events that seem to be related. If you want to dig a little deeper, this will give you a good intro. Now, earlier I mentioned the term mudflood, and if you do any sort of research into Tartaria, you'll soon run into this term. So what exactly is the mudflood? The epic mudflood is a term that was coined to describe a major worldwide mudflood which occurred only a few hundred years ago that precipitated the end of the Tartarian Empire. There are differing theories on how the mud came about, such as by water flood, volcano, or heat/vibration that caused the dirt to just liquefy. Now, the official story is explained as what is referred to as the cultural layer of dirt. This layer is sediment and dust that naturally builds up around the places that humans live, but to many, this explanation just doesn't seem feasible. The proof of this flood comes from the many verified examples of buildings that have seemingly been buried or either fully or partially under the ground. There are pictures circling the internet showing Russia's Winter Palace, the U.S. Capitol building, and the St. Mary Magdalene Church having been dug out to reveal lower levels than previously known. The windows and doors of the upper floors of the buildings are quite often found to be at ground level and occasionally even found to be completely buried underneath the surface of that mud that supposedly covered the entire area. This catastrophe is believed to have caused a great reset of civilization, from the Tartarian Empire to what we live in today. Some believe this is just one of the many resets our world has experienced from the very first, which would have been Noah's flood. And if you pay attention to any of today's news, the term Great Reset is being used now, which makes the whole subject of Tartaria and the mudfloods even more intriguing. Here you see some of the other images where we see buildings that are clearly built on the foundation of older buildings. This one here would be considered a mud flood building. You see the street level is about in the middle of this particular level of the building. I don't know if there are other floors below it or not, but you can see the doors had to be dug out and the windows, are pretty much mid dirt level or ground level. Here's another example of a fairly modern picture, and underneath you see older buildings that have been excavated out. Now, another term you'll run into when researching this topic is star forts. Now, star forts are, as the name implies, star-shaped structures, indeed found all over the world and appear to be hundreds of years old. The reason they are mentioned here is because they are believed to be associated with the ancient civilization Tartaria. Just as Tartaria seems to have similar architecture with respect to its buildings, there appears to be the same similarity and association concerning star forts. As I mentioned, they are found throughout the world, including the US, France, Denmark, Italy, Malta, Slovakia, and many other countries. The purpose of these star forts is not definitively known. Many speculate they could have been structures used to supply water to the area. Others say they were designed in their configuration for energy production, and others say they were simply actual military forts. What we do know is that they are a common phenomenon, which suggests the technology was shared throughout the world. A lot of times you'll see them, they're surrounded by water or very near water. Next, we want to look at another term that's antiquitech. Here, you should think Tesla tech in cathedrals or domes. In the time of the Tartarians, cathedrals and dome buildings supposedly harnessed etheric energy, natural energy in the air, and converted it into electricity. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the architecture of the Tartarian Empire seemed to be consistent throughout the countries it ruled. One unique aspect of this architecture is domes and spires on many of the buildings that had antennas or other metal structures that many believed were actually utilized to collect energy from the ether and provide electricity to buildings and homes. These antennas/structures are often identified as antiquitech, combining the terms antiquity and technology. Now, let's talk about Foundlings and the Orphan trains. Very interesting. Now, it is a fact that from approximately 1850 to 1930, hundreds of thousands of supposed orphans were distributed throughout the U.S. and world, many by trains that would arrive in a certain city and people could adopt them. This is a well-documented fact. A notice would be placed about the children's arrival in advance, and people would show up and essentially just take them home to adopt and, perhaps more importantly, work on their farms. These children were called foundlings, as if they were just found, and it was a worldwide phenomenon. Their journey usually began in the children's asylums or hospitals where they would end up or be taken to, and the children were then given made-up names and sent out from the cities to rural areas. They either found foster parents, worked as farmhands, or grew up on their own with a completely new identity and no knowledge of their heritage. Now, the official story was that the parents died of disease or war or could not afford to take care of them. The story goes that during the 1850s, there were thousands of children living on the streets in several major cities. These children were in search of food, shelter, and money, and sold rags or matches and newspapers just to survive. So the orphan train movement was supposedly a supervised welfare program that transported orphans and homeless children from crowded eastern cities of the United States to foster homes located largely in rural areas of the Midwest. The orphan trains operated between 1854 and 1929, relocating about 200,000 orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless children. Now, while the official narrative sets the number at about 200,000 for the U.S. alone, some believe the actual number was over 1 million. Similar orphan-related operations were getting executed all over the world, and some children were allegedly even moved to a different country. Now, how does all this fit into the whole Tartaria storyline, you ask? Well, if Tartarian society had been wiped out, there would be a need to repopulate. And what better new citizens than the very young who would not question where all the existing cities and buildings came from? Again, I'll attempt to avoid most of the questions of why these things occurred and instead focus on did these things actually occur? And in the case of the orphan trains, it most certainly did. Now, let's talk about new chronology in Anatoly Fomenko, pictured here. Now, earlier I mentioned one theory tied to the whole supposed cover-up is that centuries of time have actually just been added to our official timeline, in essence creating phantom time. Time we read about in history books, but that never existed in reality. It dates back to around 1500 when a man named Joseph Justus Scaliger supposedly made edits to our history in the 1500s. These edits were justified under the auspice of translating dates from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. During these edits, Scaliger created around 1,000 years of phantom history, partly known as the medieval period or the Dark Ages. It is claimed that civilization actually went straight from the fall of Rome into the Renaissance, skipping the Dark Ages altogether, and that the Dark Ages didn't actually exist, but were just inserted. Many proponents of this theory point to the lack of original writings and actual history that can be traced to the Middle Ages as proof supporting their hypothesis. Indeed, there seems to be plenty of provable history from before and after the Dark Ages, but not so much from that time period. Now, Sir Isaac Newton was a major critic of Scaliger's new history that was created because it conflicted with his mathematical equations predicting solar and lunar eclipses. These eclipses no longer occurred in the predictable pattern they should have when using Scaliger's new dates. Now, astronomers at the time suggested the moon had the power to speed up and slow down to match the recorded dates of historical eclipses. That was something which Newton strongly rejected and actually had his own theories about. Fast forward to the 20th century, when Russian physicist and astronomer Anatoly Fomenko revived the case. His theory for the impossible eclipse dates is that the centuries of phantom time were indeed added to the calendar in the 1500s. He claimed if one restores the old Julian calendar while synchronizing the fall of Rome with the fall of Constantinople, then all the historical eclipse dates work again perfectly. Basically, the theory states that unless the sun and moon can speed up or slow down periodically, which doesn't seem reasonable, then our historical timeline is indeed off. Now, if this theory is correct, most of the Dark Ages from the 5th to the 14th centuries were inserted, meaning the Renaissance actually began immediately following the fall of the Roman Empire, putting our current date we live in somewhere between 1000 to 1700 AD. Needless to say, there are, of course, many who reject Fomenko's new chronology, but it does strongly bring into question our current accepted timeline to at least some degree. So, how does phantom time tie into all this? Well, if there did exist civilizations in America before our arrival with developed cities, this time period would also have to be erased, or it would threaten the official timeline we have now. Most people, or many people, believe that is precisely what happened, and while some of those Tartarian buildings still survive, most have been destroyed are ravaged by mysterious fires. As I mentioned earlier, proving the why is not my goal. Why these things may have happened. I simply want to know if these things occurred. The why is another ball of wax altogether. The why is the question that inevitably gets asked, however, when evidence is presented and met with skepticism. When most people are confronted with evidence that whole developed cities existed before the colonization of America, it hits them rather strongly, and their first reaction is to ask the question, why? Their reason cannot allow them to believe these things unless the question, why, can be answered. One thing we should all keep in mind is that these are two separate questions, why and if. And if something occurred or not requires no burden to supply the why. I'll leave you to ponder the why. So the question becomes, did the settlers build all these magnificent structures themselves, or did we just inherit these magnificent cities? Just keep in mind that not every rabbit hole contains a rabbit, but there are some that do. Thanks for watching. This is Quest Logos, and I'm J. Trevor Adkins. Take care, and God bless.